Imagine a world where the sun is swallowed by concrete, where the air is thick with the smell of waste and fear, and the only light comes from a trembling kerosene lamp. A world beneath your feet, a labyrinth of filth, where life and death hang on the single flickering promise of a former thief and sewer worker. This is the true story of Leopold Socha, a man who looked into the abyss of the Holocaust and chose to become a reluctant, gritty, and utterly essential hero. He wasn't a priest or a politician. He was just a man with dirty hands and a knowledge of the Lviv sewer system that would become the last sanctuary on earth for over a dozen souls. This is the story of their fight for survival, their descent into darkness, and the unbelievable light they found in the shadows of a collapsing world. Listen closely, because the sounds you're about to hear are not just those of rushing water. They are the sounds of desperation, courage, and a miracle born in the deepest dark. Whoa, 1943. The city smelled different now. It used to be a vibrant mix of Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish life. The smell of fresh bread, strong coffee, and 1,000 years of history. Now, the main odor was the stench of fear, overlaid with the sharp, metallic tang of German occupation. And for Leopold Socha, a petty criminal turned municipal sewer worker, the air he breathed was literally the city's waste. It was a dirty, thankless job, but it was his territory. He knew the tunnels, the manholes, the currents, and the secret places better than anyone else in the city, maybe even better than the rats. Leopold was a survivor, a hustler. He wasn't a good man, not by the standards of the church. He'd done time in jail, lifted a wallet or two, and generally looked out for number one. The war, oddly, had given him a certain freedom. While everyone else was starving or being rounded up, Leopold and his partner, Stefan Robluski, were vital workers. They kept the sewer system running, which the Germans, for all their brutality, still needed. They were invisible, and in a time of genocide, invisibility was gold. The first time Leopold heard the talk, it was just a rumor echoing down a manhole shaft. The Germans were intensifying the liquidation of the Jewish ghetto. People were desperate. Stories circulated about those trying to escape, hiding in attics, in false walls, or anywhere a body could squeeze. Then came the unbelievable, a whisper that people were offering serious money to hide in the sewers. Leopold's eyes, normally cynical and guarded, lit up. Money. It was the only thing that mattered in this hell. He scoffed at the idea of helping anyone out of the goodness of his heart, but a large stack of zlotys? That was a different story. He started to watch. He saw the transports, the violence, the absolute terror in the faces of the people being dragged away. And then he saw them. A small group, huddled near an old storm drain opening, talking in hushed, frantic tones. They looked terrified, but determined. They had a bag that looked heavy, like it held all their worldly goods. And more importantly, it looked like it held cash. This wasn't an act of mercy for Leopold. It was a business opportunity. A dangerous, insane, incredibly profitable business opportunity. He knew the risks. If the Germans found out he was hiding Jews, it wouldn't be a jail cell for him. It would be a bullet. But he also knew the power of his labyrinth. He could keep them hidden. He could keep them alive. For a price. He spat on the ground, adjusted his lamp, and stepped out of the shadow. His voice echoed, cutting through the fear-filled air. "Looking for the rat's path, are you?" he said. "It's going to cost you." And with that cold, calculating question, the ultimate act of heroism began not with a noble vow, but with a greedy transaction. The group that stood before Leopold Socha that cold night was an unlikely collection of people bound by a single, shared terror. There were 10 of them at first, all strangers before the war had forced them into shared hiding spaces. The core of the group was the Weiss family, Ignacy, his wife, and their 2 children, and the Chigier family, Powell and his young daughter, Christina, who was only 7. The rest were various friends and acquaintances, people who had pooled every last coin and piece of jewelry to buy their lives back. Ignacy Weiss, the unofficial leader, was the one who spoke. He was trembling, but his voice was steady. "We know what you do, Socha," he said, using Leopold's last name like a plea. "We have money. 10,000 zlotys now. More when you get us out." Leopold whistled softly. 10,000 zlotys was a fortune. It was enough to keep him comfortable for a year or more. He looked the group over. They were clean, well-dressed despite the circumstances, and looked like they wouldn't last 5 minutes down below. The women looked brittle with fear, and the little girl, Christina, clung to her father's leg, her eyes wide like dark saucers. 10,000 is just for a day or two, Leopold lied, his greed overriding his conscience for a brief moment. This is not a hotel. It's a sewer. It's my life you're buying, not just a hiding spot. After a tense negotiation, they settled on a lower, but still astronomical, daily rate. The clock started ticking. The entrance was a rusted, heavy manhole cover in a dark, seldom used alley. Leopold and Stefan, his partner, used a pry bar to lift it, the scraping metal echoing like a gunshot in the silent night. The smell hit them immediately, a foul, dizzying mix of sulfur, rot, and sewage. Ignacy didn't flinch. He just held up the lantern he'd brought, a sturdy railway lamp, and looked at Leopold. "Lead us," he commanded. The first descent was agonizing. They had to climb down a narrow, slimy ladder into a black pit. The children were lowered carefully, crying softly, muffled by the sheer weight of the darkness. Powell Chigir tried to comfort his daughter, but the sound of the running water, a gurgling, aggressive river of waste, overpowered him. The group moved slowly, their descent a profound act of faith and terror. Leopold led them deep into the tunnels, miles away from the main lines and away from the occasional sewer patrol. He took them to a small, dry area near a junction box, a space he used to stash tools. It was barely bigger than a closet, but it was above the main current. It was their ark. "This is it," Leopold said, his voice flat. "You stay quiet. You don't use lights unless you have to. And you don't move. If the water rises, you move up to that ledge." He pointed to a thin shelf of concrete near the ceiling. "I'll be back tomorrow for the payment. And for whatever rotten bread I can buy you." He slammed the manhole cover back in place. The sound was a definitive, terrifying clunk. They were alone, entombed in the filth and the dark. Outside, the world went on, oblivious to the fact that 10 people had just traded everything they had for a life in the subterranean darkness. Life in the sewers immediately became a lesson in the brutal physics of survival. The 10 refugees quickly established a horrifying routine. The most pressing issue was the darkness. The only light was the kerosene lamp they had brought, which had to be used sparingly to conserve fuel. The hours were measured by the rise and fall of the water and the distant echo of their own heartbeats. When the lamp was out, the darkness was absolute, a heavy blanket that pressed down on their sanity. The smell was the second enemy. It never went away. It permeated their clothes, their hair, and their very skin. It made eating nearly impossible at first, and it turned their tiny refuge into a constant battle against nausea. The lack of clean air, the humidity, and the cold made breathing a labor. Leopold and Stefan would visit once a day, sometimes once every 2 days. They were their lifeline, bringing them stale bread, a few rotten potatoes, and most importantly, taking their waste away. The transaction was always the same. Leopold would collect the money, count it slowly, and hand over the meager rations. He was professional, cold, and strictly business. He never lingered, never offered a kind word. The longer he stayed, the greater the risk. But the most dangerous thing in the sewer was the water. Lviv was a hilly city, and when it rained, especially a heavy summer storm, the sewers became raging rivers. One evening, the rumbling started not as a distant thunder, but as a vibration in the concrete floor. Before they could react, a torrent of black, churning water surged through the main channel, rising with terrifying speed. Ignacy Weiss screamed for everyone to get up to the narrow ledge, the only high ground in their small chamber. The current was so powerful it sounded like a roaring train. Powell had to physically lift Christina and hold her against the cold, slimy wall. The water level came within inches of the ledge before it began to recede, leaving behind a coating of sludge and a chilling realization. Their sanctuary was temporary and could become their grave at any moment. During one of Leopold's visits after a particularly bad storm, something shifted. He was counting the money, his expression impassive, when he noticed how thin Powell Chigir was, how defeated the older women looked, and the sheer terror in Christina's eyes. He saw the remnants of their meager meal, bread soaked in murky water. His greed, which had been his sole motivation, started to wrestle with something unfamiliar, something heavy and uncomfortable. Empathy. "The money's running out, Leopold." Ignacy whispered, his voice hoarse from the damp air. We have maybe 2 weeks left. Leopold paused his counting. He looked at the few coins left in Ignacy's hand, then at the desperate faces surrounding him. A calculation ran through his head. If they ran out of money, he'd have to leave them, and they would surely die. Something snapped. It wasn't a moment of conversion, just a grunt of acknowledgement. I know a better spot, he muttered, dropping the money into his sack. Deeper, smaller, harder to find, but you'll need new clothes. Yours are rotting. He turned to leave, then stopped. The payment stays the same, he said, trying to reassert his mercenary status. But I'll bring some candles tomorrow. It's too dark down here. It was the first unpaid kindness he had offered, a tiny, flickering rebellion against his own nature and the death that reigned above. The labyrinth had rules, and for the first time, Leopold Socha was breaking one of them. The new hiding spot Leopold mentioned was deeper, and reaching it was a terrifying journey through the wet, slick underworld. It was located in a larger, but abandoned, rainwater cistern that connected to the main lines only through a tiny, forgotten overflow pipe. The only problem was getting there. It required traversing nearly a mile of narrow tunnels, often wading through fast-moving, cold water, and in some spots, actually crawling through the muck. It took Leopold and Stefan 2 days of intense, secret labor to prepare the route. They had to clear debris, secure a few loose sections of pipe, and, most importantly, move the group's meager belongings. The refugees, initially 10, had grown by 3 more people, a young couple and their infant child, the Solomon family, who had managed to find Ignacy Weiss through a clandestine network just hours before the ghetto was sealed off completely. Leopold, seeing their desperation and the child, found himself unable to turn them away, even though the price they offered was nearly nothing. His business model was dissolving into something much more complex. The relocation itself was harrowing. It happened on a moonless night. Leopold went ahead with his lantern, his movements quick and professional. Powell Chigier carried his daughter Christina, muffling her small cries against his chest. The smell of the sewage was overwhelming, and the fear was a palpable thing that tasted like copper in their mouths. The cistern, when they finally reached it, was a miracle. It was a concrete chamber about 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, with a high vaulted ceiling. Crucially, it was mostly dry and far above the immediate floodline. It was their fortress. Leopold, driven by his reluctant sense of responsibility, spent the next few days bringing them supplies. Not just the rotten bread, but tools. He brought a small shovel and bucket for sanitation, some wooden planks to build a makeshift sleeping platform above the damp floor, and a few yards of thick, black rubber sheeting to use as a privacy screen. You are invisible here, Leopold told Ignacy, wiping sweat and filth from his brow. The main flow is that way. He pointed to a distant rumble, and the Germans only patrol the widest pipes. No one comes down this deep. But if you make noise, I can't help you. Stefan, who had mostly remained silent and uncomfortable during this whole affair, grumbled. This is too much, Poldek. We're spending more time down here than working our real jobs. The risk isn't worth what little they have left. Leopold silenced him with a harsh glare. He knew Stefan was right. The daily payment had become symbolic, barely covering the cost of the bread he brought, let alone the kerosene. But every time he saw Christina or the infant Solomon, a knot of obligation tightened in his chest. He was no longer just a paid guard. He was the architect of their underground world. He was the thin, greasy layer between them and the abyss. He was committed. The man who had been a thief was now stealing life from the hands of death, and the payment for that, he was slowly realizing, wasn't measured in zlotys. As the weeks turned into months, the risks Leopold and Stefan took grew exponentially. The German noose around Lwo tightened. They started conducting random, brutal searches, and the sewer system, being part of the city's infrastructure, wasn't immune. Leopold's day became a grueling, high-stakes charade. He would perform his official maintenance duties, often under the watchful eye of German foremen, while simultaneously executing his secret mission. He had to time his visits to the cistern perfectly, usually during the dark hours of the early morning or late evening, and always using different, winding routes to avoid creating a predictable pattern. The simple act of bringing food and supplies was now a matter of life and death. He couldn't just walk into a store and buy 13 loaves of bread. That would raise suspicion. Instead, he had to buy small amounts from multiple vendors across the city, hiding the bundles in his work satchel, which was normally reserved for wrenches and flashlights. He learned to barter for spoiled vegetables that others wouldn't touch. His own meager rations went to the people in the cistern. Leopold, the hustler, was now struggling to feed himself, all while carrying the immense burden of 13 lives. One day, while he and Stefan were working near a main access point, a German SS officer accompanied by a technical squad descended into the sewer. They were inspecting for sabotage, the officer barking orders in harsh German. Leopold's blood ran cold. The cistern was miles away, but the officer's presence itself was a terrifying breach of his territory. As the squad passed, the officer's boot slipped on the wet concrete. He cursed loudly and looked directly at Leopold. "You? Pull. Is this system stable?" he demanded in broken Polish. Leopold, terrified but trying to appear slow-witted and compliant, gave a rambling, technical explanation about the water flow and the structural integrity, drawing on all his genuine knowledge of the pipes. He kept his hands dirty, his posture subservient, playing the role of the dumb laborer. The officer, disgusted by the filth and the smell, waved him away. "Filthy work. Get back to it." When the squad finally left, Leopold leaned against a cold pipe, his heart hammering like a hammer on steel. Stefan, white-faced, stared at him. "That was close, Poldek. Too close." Leopold didn't answer right away. He knew that the moment they stopped being ordinary workers, they would become targets. The line between Leopold Socha, the sewer worker, and Leopold Socha, the savior, was getting thinner by the day, and he realized he was starting to prefer the latter. The fear was constant, but it was now laced with a strange, fierce pride. He was actively defying the absolute power of the Reich, hidden beneath the ground, in the foulest corner of the city. He had made a covenant with the darkness, and he would keep it. For the people in the cistern, the greatest battle was not against hunger or the rising water, it was against madness. The sheer, unending monotony of the dark was a psychological cage. Time stretched and warped. They lost track of days and weeks. The only indicator was Leopold's unpredictable visits. They learned to live in silence. A cough, a dropped piece of metal, a child's cry. Any small sound carried through the concrete tubes and could mean instant discovery and death. They developed a silent sign language for basic requests. The children, Christina Chigier and the infant Solomon, were the most vulnerable to the silence. Christina, who was accustomed to the vibrancy of life, was slowly suffocating under the weight of the endless night. Powell Chigier, observing his daughter fading, approached Ignacy Weiss, his voice a dry whisper. "She needs sunlight, Ignacy. She needs to know the world is still there. We can't keep her here forever." "We have no choice, Powell," Ignacy replied, his own face etched with the despair of a man whose world had shrunk to a concrete box. "If we leave, we die. If we make noise, Leopold dies, and then we die anyway." The atmosphere in the cistern was thick with suppressed emotion. The constant proximity, the lack of privacy, and the shared trauma created deep bonds and sharp frictions. A harsh word over a crust of bread could turn into a full-blown crisis. Ignacy, a natural leader, maintained order with quiet discipline, enforcing strict rules on light use and sanitation. Leopold, during one of his rare extended visits, noticed the shift. The initial terror in their eyes had been replaced by a deep, weary exhaustion. He saw Christina sitting quietly, her small hands covering her ears, even though there was no noise. He knelt beside her. "What's wrong, Krisha?" he asked softly. She pointed to the ceiling, then made a winding motion with her finger. "The stories," she whispered, her voice rusty. "I can't remember the birds. Or the color red." Leopold felt a powerful jolt. This wasn't just physical survival. It was the survival of the human spirit. He reached into his sack, pulled out a few small, damp pieces of paper and a dull pencil he used for marking pipes. He handed them to her. "Draw," he said. "Draw the birds. Draw the red. Draw the colors so you don't forget them." He stayed for an hour that day, longer than ever before. He described the surface world, the sound of a passing streetcar, the color of the sky, the smell of burnt coal. He was feeding them memories, proving that life still existed. As he finally prepared to leave, Ignacy held his hand, a silent gesture of gratitude that transcended payment. Leopold left the cistern not feeling like a thief, but like a storyteller. He realized his visits were not just about logistics and safety, they were about delivering hope. He was the only link to a world they might never see again. And as he climbed back up the slimy ladder toward the noise and light of the city, he carried the immense weight of their silence, a silence that screamed for life. He knew then he wouldn't leave them, even if the money ran out completely. The bargain was no longer about cash, it was about redemption. The summer of 1944 brought the Eastern Front closer to Lviv, and with it, relentless, violent weather. The rain was not a gentle shower. It was a deluge, a constant downpour that turned the sewers into an unpredictable, subterranean monster. One afternoon, Leopold and Stefan were above ground when the sky unleashed a storm that seemed intent on washing the city away. Leopold instinctively knew the danger. This wasn't a normal rise. This was a flash flood heading straight for the cistern. He dropped his work and grabbed Stefan. "We have to go? Now. If that cistern floods, they'll drown in minutes." Stefan balked. "Poldek, look at that water. We'll drown trying to reach them. The flow is too strong." "I don't care," Leopold shouted, his usual composure shattered by adrenaline. 13 people, Stefan. We can't leave them." They descended into a tunnel that had become a roaring river. The water was chest-high in some sections, pushing them violently against the slimy walls. They had to use their training, holding onto inspection rings and pipe junctions to keep from being swept away. The sound was deafening, a terrifying mix of rushing water and debris slamming into the concrete. When they finally reached the entrance pipe leading to the cistern, they saw the horror. The water had flooded the cistern completely. Ignacy and the others were desperately clinging to the very top of the vault, their heads inches from the ceiling, breathing the thin layer of foul air trapped above the water. The small sleeping platform they had built was completely submerged. Leopold plunged into the cistern, fighting the eddying current. He helped Ignacy secure a thick, knotted rope he had brought, tying it firmly to a rusted support beam. He then began the brutal, slow process of evacuation. The children went first. Christina, shivering uncontrollably, was passed hand to hand until she reached Stefan, who was waiting at the mouth of the feeder pipe. They worked for an hour, the water relentlessly pushing them. The small Solomon infant, already weak from the damp and lack of nutrition, cried weakly, a sound that drove Leopold harder than any threat. He had to physically haul the weaker members, the older women, through the pipe and into a wider, higher main channel where the flow was fast but the space was safer. When they finally pulled the last person out, dripping and exhausted, Leopold looked back into the cistern. The water was already receding, but the damage was done. All their supplies, their platform, their few precious belongings, were gone, swept away by the fury of the flood. Leopold sat on a dry ledge, gasping for breath, surrounded by the 13 survivors. He was covered head to toe in human waste, his body aching. But as he looked at the sheer relief on their faces, particularly the pale but steady look in Ignacy's eyes, he felt something far more potent than fear or exhaustion. He had risked his life, not for money, but to save theirs. In the filth and darkness, he had found his worth. The near-drowning incident forced the refugees to temporarily relocate to the wider main channel, a much riskier spot that Leopold kept checking. He was now spending almost all his time in the sewers, neglecting his official duties and drawing suspicion. Stefan was becoming openly hostile, complaining that Leopold was dragging them both to the firing squad for no reward. The Germans, sensing the imminent collapse of their front, were growing desperate and vicious. Their sweeps were more thorough, and the patrols more frequent. One evening, Leopold descended for a routine check, bringing them a small piece of cooked meat, a rare, expensive treat he had somehow acquired. As he walked, he heard something that wasn't the natural sound of the sewer water. It was a faint scratching sound, coming from a side tunnel not far from where the refugees were now hiding. His heart pounded. It wasn't a rat. It was too rhythmic, too intentional. It sounded like someone trying to move a heavy object. Leopold extinguished his lamp and moved like a shadow, creeping toward the sound. He was ready to run or fight. As he rounded a corner, he saw a man, not one of his group, but a stranger, wearing tattered clothes and pushing a rusty grate. The man looked up, his face gaunt and covered in soot. He wasn't a German soldier, but he wasn't a refugee either. "Who are you?" Leopold whispered, his hand going to the large pipe wrench he always carried. The man jumped, his eyes wide with fear. "Please, don't hurt me. I'm Jerzy. I escaped from the Janoska concentration camp. I've been living down here for 2 weeks. I heard you talking." A new threat. Jerzy was alone, desperate, and potentially a liability. He could lead the Germans to the group, or worse, he could become a starving, desperate rival. Leopold was torn. His instinct was to secure the safety of the 13 he was responsible for. "If you tell anyone you saw me or anyone else, I will personally throw you into the main flow," Leopold hissed, his voice lethal. "Do you understand? You tell no one." Jerzy, shaking, nodded frantically. "I won't. I just want food. Please. I haven't eaten a full meal in weeks." Leopold looked at the small piece of cooked meat in his hand, intended for the Solomon infant. He hesitated for only a second. He was already starving, and now this. He split the meager portion, giving half to Jerzy, who devoured it instantly like a starving dog. This encounter solidified Leopold's shift from mercenary to true protector. He could have abandoned Jerzy, but he didn't. He pointed him to a remote, dry section of the sewer, miles away from the others. "You stay there. If I see you near the others, you're finished. But if you keep your mouth shut, I'll bring you scraps when I can." He had just added a 14th life to his burden, further complicating his daily mission and intensifying the risks. The darkness of the sewers had introduced him to a new kind of spy, a shadow who could either save or doom them all. Weeks dragged into what felt like years. The 13 refugees, now 14 with the addition of Jerzy, were surviving, but barely. The lack of vitamin D was taking a heavy toll. Their skin was pale, waxy, and brittle. Their eyesight was failing, and the children were showing signs of serious developmental issues. The infant Solomon was critically ill. Leopold saw the deterioration in every visit. He risked bringing them small medicinal drops he stole from a pharmacy, but he knew what they truly needed was air and light. He realized he had to do something impossibly risky, something that went against every rule of survival he had established. He devised a plan. He knew of an old, disused drainage pipe that ran up to an abandoned, overgrown lot near the edge of the city. The pipe was narrow, barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through, and the entrance was covered by a thick, rusted metal cap, mostly buried under weeds and dirt. He worked for 2 days clearing the surface entrance, carefully removing the dirt and camouflaging the pipe's head with branches and rocks. The day he finally told Ignacy Weiss about the plan, the man's eyes filled with a mixture of hope and terror. "It's for the children, Ignacy," Leopold insisted. "Just for a few minutes. I will be above ground the whole time. If anything moves, I shut the cap and you pull them back." The first to go was Christina. Powell Chigier wrapped her small body in a thick, dry towel, whispered frantic prayers in her ear, and pushed her gently into the narrow, dark shaft. Leopold was waiting above, his heart pounding so hard he thought the German patrols could hear it. When Christina emerged, blinking into the weak, filtered sunlight, she didn't cry. She just stood there, her mouth open, gazing at the patch of sky visible through the tree canopy. The light hit her pale face, and a look of pure, unadulterated joy transformed her features. It was a silent, powerful moment. Leopold, the hardened criminal, had tears blurring his vision. He let her sit for 5 minutes, breathing the fresh air, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. He then helped her back down, the entire operation taking no more than 10 minutes. Over the next few days, he did the same for the infant Solomon, held by his father, and the other children. This taste of daylight, this brief, stolen moment of normal life, was a powerful psychological weapon against the darkness. It was a dangerous, desperate act of defiance, but it reminded the children, and in turn, their parents, that the world was still vibrant, still colored, and still worth surviving for. Leopold had crossed a definitive line. He was no longer just protecting their bodies. He was fighting for their souls. He knew the risk was immense, but as he covered the manhole, the smell of damp earth and living grass clinging to his clothes, he felt a quiet, profound sense of righteousness he hadn't known when he was chasing zlotys. Leopold's partner, Stefan Wróblewski, had been growing increasingly nervous and resentful. He had started this adventure for money, just like Leopold, But unlike Leopold, his heart had not changed. He saw only risk, not redemption. The daily demands, the constant fear of discovery, and the near-fatal flood in Chapter 7 had pushed Stefan to his breaking point. "Poldek, we have to stop this," Stefan pleaded one day while they were supposedly inspecting a ventilation shaft. He spoke in low, urgent whispers. "The war is turning. If the Soviets come, the Germans will burn the city and clean out the sewers. We will be caught, and we will die as traitors." Leopold glared at him. "We are not traitors, Stefan. We are saving lives. These are not rats. They are people. Look at Krisha. Look at the baby. You want to send them back to the hell above ground. I want to live," Stefan retorted fiercely. "And so should you. You're neglecting your job. The foremen are watching us. I saw you bring that rope down. You're building them a house. They have no money left. Poldek, why are you doing this?" Leopold couldn't fully explain the shift in his own soul. He just knew he couldn't stop. He was bound by an invisible chain of responsibility and a deep, unexpected love for the strange family he had adopted in the dark. "The money is gone, yes," Leopold said, his voice quiet but final. "Now, it is about staying alive. For all of us. If we are caught helping them, we are dead. If we abandon them, they are dead. The risk is the same. I choose to keep them alive." Stefan walked away, muttering, his posture a mix of fear and betrayal. Leopold knew he had lost his partner. The tension between them became a dangerous, unspoken threat. Stefan started disappearing for long stretches, his work becoming sporadic. Leopold was left alone to manage the grueling logistics of feeding and protecting the 13 souls. He started relying on his wife, Magda, who, though terrified, proved to be fierce and loyal. She began buying extra food, hiding supplies under their floorboards, and acting as Leopold's crucial lookout on the surface. One freezing afternoon, Leopold saw Stefan near a German barracks, talking to a low-ranking officer. They were standing close, and Stefan was gesturing toward the city, his body language furtive and tense. Leopold froze. He didn't hear what was said, but the cold realization hit him like a physical blow. Stefan was talking to the enemy. He wasn't sure if Stefan was selling information or simply saving his own skin by providing general city gossip, but the message was clear. Leopold knew he had to assume the worst. The survival of his underground family now depended on him moving faster and smarter than his former partner. The greatest threat was no longer the German war machine, but the betrayal of a man who knew his every secret. The threat of betrayal by Stefan forced Leopold to enact a new, terrifying contingency plan. He couldn't move the entire group again, but he could secure the current position and try to mislead any potential search. He spent days reinforcing the cistern entrance, piling debris and concrete shards over the pipe, leaving only a tiny, almost invisible gap for air and passage. He needed more than just caution, he needed information. Leopold couldn't leave his sewer duties entirely, and he couldn't risk leaving Magda alone in the city. He confided his deepest fear to her, that Stefan was going to betray them all for a clean slate with the Germans. Magda, Leopold's wife, was not a strong woman, but she was a survivor, hardened by years of poverty and his own brushes with the law. She looked at him, her eyes dark with fear, but her chin held high. "If he knows where they are, we have to find out what he said," she told him. Magda began a dangerous game of her own. She approached Stefan's wife, a lonely, gossipy woman, under the guise of casual conversation. She complained about Leopold's strange, obsessive work schedule, feigning curiosity about Stefan's recent absences. She was fishing for any detail, any slip of the tongue that would confirm Leopold's suspicions. After several agonizing days, Magda returned to Leopold, her face pale. She had been successful. Stefan had told his wife that Leopold was wasting time on a lost cause, and had hinted darkly that Leopold was in deep trouble with the German foreman for unauthorized use of municipal supplies. Crucially, he had mentioned a specific junction box where Leopold often entered the pipes, a junction far from the actual cistern, but one that could lead a search team on a wild goose chase. He didn't tell her the exact location, Poldek, Magda whispered, clutching his hand. He just told her where you start your work. He's protecting himself, not selling them out entirely, but he's pointing them in the wrong direction to prove his loyalty. Leopold felt a wave of cold relief, quickly followed by renewed fear. The junction box was now compromised. If a German team was pointed there, they might decide to sweep the entire sector. He realized he owed Magda everything. Her courage, her willingness to risk her life for his secret, was the ultimate act of loyalty. From that day on, Magda became an extension of his work. She would stand watch near the suspected junction box, a basket over her arm, pretending to gather firewood. If she saw any German or Ukrainian police activity, she had a single, prearranged signal. A certain way she would tilt her head and adjust her scarf. That would tell Leopold not to descend. Magda had traded the relative safety of her home for the high-stakes, deadly role of a lookout. Her sacrifice bought the people in the cistern more time, a brief, fragile extension of their borrowed lives. The longest night came in the late summer of 1944. The roar of the Soviet cannon fire was now a constant, terrifying symphony above Lviv. The battle for the city was raging, and the war was literally being fought over their heads. In the sewers, the noise was amplified, echoing and booming through the pipes like 1,000 drums. For the refugees, who had relied on silence and stillness for so long, this was the ultimate psychological torment. Every distant explosion sounded like it was right outside their door. They huddled together in the cistern, now permanently damp and smelling strongly of fear and unwashed bodies. Leopold, unable to visit consistently due to the street fighting, was growing desperate. His visits were now fleeting moments of extreme danger, often forcing him to crawl through abandoned, shell-shocked streets. He brought little food, but he brought news, real news, whispered reports of the Soviet advance, of German desperation, and the faint, unbelievable promise of liberation. One night, the noise stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. The city was holding its breath. Then, a new sound, the heavy, unmistakable tread of boots above. Not the quick, rhythmic march of the German patrols, but a slower, more cautious, heavier footfall. And then, voices, shouting in a language Leopold didn't immediately recognize. It wasn't German, but it wasn't Russian either. It was Ukrainian militia, the brutal local forces often used by the Germans for extermination details. The voices were moving directly toward the compromised junction box Stefan had pointed to. Leopold was with the group. He had been unable to leave them that night. He pressed his ear against the concrete wall, his heart in his throat. He could hear them clearly, the scraping of tools, the thud of heavy items being set down. They were searching. "Be absolutely silent," Leopold mouthed to Ignacy, his face grim. No light, no movement, not a breath. For the next 4 hours, they existed in a state of suspended agony. They heard the sounds of the search team prying open grates and dropping stones into the dark water to test the depth. They heard a voice yell, "Check the side pipes. Check for any diversions." The search team was close, perhaps only a few hundred yards away, their voices carrying easily through the pipe system. Christina, trembling, tried to stifle a cry. Powell clapped his hand over her mouth, tears streaming down his face as he held her tightly. The infant Solomon, sensing the terror, began a soft, weak whimper. Leopold, clutching his pipe wrench, stared at the pipe opening, ready to fight, ready to sell his life dearly. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the voices receded. The footsteps grew faint. The silence returned, but this time, it was the fragile, stunned silence of exhausted survival. They had been spared. The compromised junction had led the search away, buying them time. Leopold understood the significance. They were in the final moments of the war, and they had just survived the closest call yet. The city was still shaking, but the foundation of their underground world, built on courage and betrayal, had held. The siege of Lviv was short, bloody, and decisive. On July 27, 1944, the Soviet Red Army finally drove the Germans out of the city. For Leopold and the 13 people in the cistern, the shift from absolute terror to cautious hope was wrenching. The first sign of the change wasn't a sound, but a smell. The usual scent of fear and German smoke was replaced by the acrid, metallic smell of fresh explosives, burnt debris, and, strangely, the smell of cabbage soup and cheap Soviet tobacco. The surface world was transitioning, and with it, the sewer system was becoming chaotic. Soviet soldiers, unfamiliar with the city, were often using the larger tunnels for quick, undetected movement or even for shelter from snipers. Leopold's risk factor skyrocketed. If the Germans had executed him for treason, the Soviets might shoot him as a collaborator or simply an unwelcome witness. He had to be incredibly careful. He went to the cistern one final time with his news, a small loaf of fresh bread, and a bottle of wine he had miraculously kept hidden. He found the refugees in their usual spot, exhausted but alive. "It is done," Leopold whispered, his voice hoarse. "The Germans are gone. The Red Army is in the city. The war is over for Lwów." Ignacy Weiss did not celebrate immediately. He was too seasoned by suffering to trust easily. "Is it safe, Leopold? Are the streets clear?" "No," Leopold admitted. "It's chaos. Looting, fighting, and the Soviets are rounding up people. We have to wait. But the men who wanted to kill you are gone." He raised the bottle of wine. "Today, we drink to life, not to freedom." "Not yet." They shared the bread and the wine in the darkness, a quiet, profound communion between the rescuer and the rescued. It was the first time Leopold had genuinely sat with them, not as a paid guard, but as a family member. He told them about the street fighting, the destroyed buildings, and the sheer joy of the few citizens who dared to celebrate. Over the next few days, Leopold and Magda started the careful process of bringing the 13 up. They did it in pairs, at night, using the narrow drainage pipe they had used for the daylight visits. The reunion with the surface world was brutal. The former refugees, blind from the darkness and weak from starvation, stumbled into the open air. The taste of fresh air was dizzying. The light, even at night, was blinding. Christina, the little girl, was the last to emerge. She stood on the grass, trembling, looking up at the moon and the stars, which she hadn't seen in over 14 months. She reached out and touched Leopold's hand. He was no longer covered in sewer filth. He was wearing the clean clothes Magda had brought him. "You saved the stars for me," Christina whispered, her voice fragile. Leopold simply nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. He had done more than save their lives. He had saved their connection to the world. The ascent into the daylight was not the end of their troubles. It was the beginning of a new kind of suffering. The refugees, 13 people, Jerzy, the lone escapee, had found his own way out earlier, had survived the genocide, but the world had moved on. They had nothing, no homes, no clothes, no identity papers, and no status under the new Soviet regime. Leopold and Magda took the group to a deserted, half-bombed bakery on the outskirts of the city. It was a ruin, but it offered 4 walls and a makeshift roof. They gave them the few blankets and clothes they had, sharing their last stores of food. The immediate challenges were medical. The group suffered from severe malnutrition, rickets, and various infections caused by their long confinement. The Solomon infant was taken by Magda to a local, sympathetic doctor she knew, who treated the child in secret. The hardest reality, however, was identity. Ignacy Weiss, now the clear leader, tried to find out who else had survived the Lwów ghetto. The news was devastating. 99% of the Jewish population was gone. Families were annihilated. The 13 were a miracle, a handful of survivors in a city of ghosts. Leopold helped them in every way he could. He used his connections in the municipal offices to secure them rudimentary papers. He knew the Germans would have shot him for this, and the Soviets would punish him severely if they found out he was aiding survivors who were not part of their approved system. His role had shifted again, from underground guard to surface facilitator and fixer. One day, Ignacy handed Leopold a small, velvet pouch. Inside were diamonds and a few gold coins, the last of their pooled treasure, miraculously saved from the flood by being sewn into the lining of one of the women's dresses. "Leopold," Ignacy said, his voice heavy with emotion. "This is everything we have. Take it. It's for you and Magda. You earned it 1,000 times over." Leopold looked at the diamonds, glinting in the pale sunlight filtering through the broken windows of the bakery. It was more wealth than he had ever dreamed of possessing. He remembered the thrill of the initial transaction, the coldness of his greedy heart. He closed the pouch and pushed it back into Ignacy's hand. "No," he said simply. "Keep it. You need it to start over. For papers. For passage." Ignacy stared at him, stunned. "But the payment, Leopold? You risked your life for this." "I took the first payment," Leopold replied, looking away, embarrassed by the sudden emotion that swelled in his chest. "I took it when I was a thief. I am not that man anymore." What I did because I had to. And for Krisha, that's payment enough. The man who started as a greedy criminal had achieved a profound, unexpected, and complete redemption. He walked out of the bakery, leaving behind the only payment that truly mattered: 13 living, breathing souls. After the liberation of Lviv, the 13 survivors slowly began to rebuild their lives. The war wasn't over across the whole continent, but for them, the immediate fear was gone. They dispersed, some staying in the area, others taking the perilous journey west to try and find surviving family or a place to start anew, far from the shadows of Eastern Europe. Leopold Socha returned to his job in the sewer system. He was once again a simple municipal worker, his hands perpetually dirty, his face obscured by the anonymity of his labor. But inside, he was transformed. The former thief was now a quiet hero, bound by an unbreakable, unspoken secret. He never sought recognition. He kept in touch with the families for a time, sometimes meeting Ignacy or Powell for a discreet, silent nod in a cafe, just to confirm they were still alive. They would always try to offer him money or gifts, and he would always refuse. Leopold's true reward came from Christina. Years later, when she was old enough to understand the magnitude of what he had done, she would write to him. Her letters were full of the colors and sounds he had helped her remember. Descriptions of flowers, the taste of clean water, and the sound of children laughing under an open sky. In 1946, just 2 years after the liberation he helped secure, Leopold Socha was riding his bicycle through the streets of Lviv. He was on his way home from work, perhaps thinking of his wife, or perhaps thinking of the lives he had saved. It was a beautiful, ordinary summer day. A Soviet army truck, driving carelessly, hit him. Leopold Socha, the man who had faced down German terror and raging floods to save 13 lives, died instantly in a mundane street accident. His grave was unremarkable. He was not celebrated in the Soviet-controlled city, and his story remained a secret known only to the survivors. It wasn't until the 1970s that the survivors, who had spread across the globe, began to tell the story of the man who saved them in the sewer. In 1978, the State of Israel formally recognized Leopold Socha as righteous among the nations, a title given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. His wife, Magda, was also honored. The medal was a quiet, necessary acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid. Leopold Socha was just a flawed man, a humble sewer worker who stumbled into an act of unparalleled heroism. He didn't start with a noble heart, but in the deepest, foulest darkness of the world, he found his conscience and became a light, proving that even a person wrestling with their own darkness can achieve the most profound redemption. The lives of those 13 survivors, who went on to have children and grandchildren, became his true monument, a growing, vibrant tribute to the man who found the best part of himself beneath the streets of a dying city. And that, listeners, is the incredible, humbling true story of Leopold Socha and the 13 souls he saved. For 14 months, they lived in a world measured by the flow of sewage, the flicker of a lamp, and the terrifying sound of footsteps overhead. This story reminds us that heroes don't always wear shining armor. Sometimes, they wear dirty boots and carry a pipe wrench. Leopold Socha started as a greedy man looking for a payoff, but he finished as a righteous man who gave away his fortune and risked his life until the very end. His legacy isn't written in history books, but in the dozens of lives he made possible across the world today. It's a powerful lesson, isn't it? That even in the darkest circumstances, the choice to be good, the choice to be human, remains entirely ours. What do you think was the turning point for Leopold? Was it the flood, the children, or the realization that the money was running out? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story of survival and redemption moving, please hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of history's most compelling true stories. Thank you for listening.